Welcome to today's webinar brought to you by AWSI. Celebrating our 25th anniversary, AWSI offers a complete package of employee and applicant screening services, including drug and alcohol testing, background checks, and other key verification and assessment services. As a trusted partner of major U.S. and internationally based companies in a wide variety of industries, AWSI exceeds expectations by offering innovative services, superior customer support, and a personalized approach to meet clients' research, investigative, and background check needs. Today's presentation is entitled, The Synthetic Drug Trend and What You Can Do About It. It'll be presented by Bill Current of the Current Consulting Group. Bill Current is the president and founding partner of the Current Consulting Group and the publisher of the online Ultimate Guide to State Drug Testing Laws at statedrugtestinglaws.com. He's the author of 10 books on substance-related issues, including the popular title, Why Drug Testing? Current Consulting Group is a leading provider of drug testing policy writing services and works with companies to help them optimize their drug testing return on investment. He also administers the annual Drug Testing Industry Survey in the United States, now in its 16th year. It'll now be our pleasure to hear from Bill Current.
Well, thank you very much, Sammy, and welcome to everyone who's on today's webinar. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge AWSI for sponsoring these webinars. There's so much need for good, accurate, and timely information in the drug testing industry. Whether you're in the industry as a provider or whether you're outside of the industry, so to speak, as a buyer or as an end user of the products and services that are provided. And so my appreciation goes out to AWSI for providing these webinars on a regular basis. We're going to spend some time today talking about a topic that is extremely important, and I want to just let you know right from the beginning that I have more slides than I'm going to be able to cover today. I did that on purpose, though, because we're going to send you the slides. Everyone who's on today's webinar will receive the slides, and you'll have all of this extra information to go over as you have the opportunity. Also, you're going to receive information on how to access the recording of today's presentation as well. So you're going to get the slides, and you're going to get the recording of today's presentation, and all of that is thanks to AWSI. We're going to talk about synthetic drugs, and in particular, I'm going to spend most of the time talking about synthetic cannabinoids like K2 and spice. Also going to talk for a while about bath salts. And then at the end, I've got some, if we have time, I've got some slides at the end I'll take you through on some new emerging synthetic drugs, some that perhaps you have not heard about yet, some that are just emerging in Europe but are expected to make their way across the ocean and into the United States this year. So we'll talk about those things as we get going. But first, let me just sort of set the stage with just a reminder of the magnitude of the drug problem in the United States. There's a study that comes out every year. It's called the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. It comes out from the from the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. That's an agency within the Department of Health and Human Services. And it measures the levels of drug abuse in many different categories. So I'm only going to share a couple of things with you on these next 3 slides, but go back and look at this. Go online and look at this. You can find information broken down by employment, by gender, by education, by income, by drug category. It's got illicit drugs. It's got alcohol. It's got cigarettes. A lot of stuff is in there. And they've been doing this stuff since the 1970s. So you can compare data over the last 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, etc. According to last year's report, there were nearly 24 million Americans 12 and older who admitted to being current or past month illicit drug users. And as you see in that third bullet, the vast majority were marijuana users. Okay, that is the most commonly used illicit drug. I'm underscoring that here because it has a direct link to the growing trend of individuals using synthetic marijuana. And I've got some statistics to make that comparison for you. I also want to, and there's some information here that's very interesting, but it sort of comes out on this graph here in front of us. I want to compare marijuana to other drugs so you get a a good idea of just how big the problem is with marijuana and why people are using synthetic marijuana. So we talked about 24 million people, 12 and older, who admit to being current illicit drug users. That means when they were called on the phone by one of the surveyors, they were asked if they've used marijuana in the last 30 days, in the 30 days prior to being interviewed. 18.9 million people admitted that they were current illicit drug users. Now, just to put this in perspective, the federal government did a study of this survey to determine how accurate it really is. And the results of the study concluded that these numbers are as much as 1/3 lower than they really are. In other words, people lie when the federal government calls them on the phone and asks them if they're using illegal drugs. Who would have thought, right? So if that 18.9 million was increased by 1/3, we'd add another 6 million thereabout to the total, okay? So there'd be 24, 25 million past month users of marijuana. Look at the second category under marijuana, the second drug of the most commonly abused, and that's psychotherapeutics. And just, this is off the topic, but let me just make this point, because this is something that companies like AWSI can help you with. If you're not testing for the drugs that people are abusing, then you're really just fooling yourself if you think that you truly are establishing a drug-free workplace with your drug testing program. If you're just testing for marijuana, which is critical, I mean, don't stop testing for marijuana. But the psychotherapeutic drugs is the #2 category of drug abuse in our country right now. Those are the sedatives and the tranquilizers, the oxys and the hydros, you know, the oxycodone, the hydrocodone, those kinds of drugs, the drugs that people are illicitly using. They're legal substances when properly prescribed, but they're being illegally used or illicitly used. And that's the #2 category of drug abuse. And that's a category of drugs that many employers do not test for. Yet there is no state in the United States, and we track state drug testing laws all the time, as Sammy mentioned, through our online state law service called The Ultimate Guide to State Drug Testing Laws at statedrugtestinglaws.com. We track state laws. There is no state that prohibits you from testing for these psychotherapeutic drugs. So it's something to keep in mind. But notice what's missing from this list. There are no listings for synthetic cannabinoids. There's no listing for bath salts here. The government tracks that. It's just not included in the survey. So I've got some statistics coming up that I think you'll find very interesting in that regard. Just as we conclude this little introduction on the magnitude of the problem, just look at the levels of drug abuse by young people, ages 12 to 13, then 14 to 15, then 16 to 17. I just want to point out that, yes, by the time young people are seniors in high school, marijuana has really, really catapulted to the top of the list, 14 million. But look at down below there. When they're 12 and 13, the #1 drug of abuse are these psychotherapeutics, the misuse of prescription drugs that they're probably, in many cases, getting from their own home. And then, even though psychotherapeutic drug abuse goes up, marijuana starts to really catch on among 14 and 15 years old. And then by the ages of 16, 17, when kids are juniors and seniors in high school thereabouts, yes, psychotherapeutic drug abuse has continued to rise, but marijuana really shoots to the top there. And you see the other drugs really lagging far behind. It's not as if it's not an issue. It is an issue, and it's something very important. But it doesn't compare to the levels of drug abuse for marijuana and psychotherapeutics. Now, if we added in K2 and spice, just synthetic cannabinoids, not bath salts and other drugs, just among young people, you would see the numbers, you would see that number probably exceed the number for psychotherapeutic drug abuse. In other words, it would be the #2 category of drug abuse among young people. Why are we talking about that when so many of you are employers or you're providing services to employers? Because these are the people that are going to be looking for jobs next year. As they graduate from high school, you know, today's teen drug user is tomorrow's job applicant. And so you have to be aware of these trends. You have to also understand that there are other drugs besides those that are in this report that young people are using. So we're going to segue now into a little talk about the synthetic drugs. This is an excellent report. Again, you're going to get these slides so you can, you know, just cut and paste that URL at the bottom and go straight to this report from CNN back in December entitled "Deadly High: How Synthetic Drugs Are Killing Kids." Again, it's a story about some kids who are using illicit drugs. But it's not just a story about kids. It's a problem that affects people of all ages. In fact, there is a study that I just saw this morning as I was preparing for today's presentation that showed the levels of synthetic drug abuse, K2, spice, bath salts, etc., among people over the age of 40 and all the way up into the, like I think it was 40 to 65. And so while it's not as high as other drugs of abuse, it's still a drug that people in those more advanced stages are using. But this is a very interesting story, and if you watch the whole program on CNN website, it's about 45 minutes, you'll find a lot of information that goes well beyond just the story, the tragic story of these two young men. But if technology cooperates with us, I want to just show you about a 2.5-minute segment from that report. Well, I take it that I didn't see any people writing in that they couldn't hear or see that, so it looks like it worked. But here's the point: as this particular segment of that story was trailing off, it mentioned that there have been over 300 different types of synthetic drugs that have come into the United States or have become popular in the United States over the last 3-4 years. This is significant because we're dealing with substances that people of all ages, even though this was a story about a couple of young men who tragically lost their lives, that people of all ages are using, and they're working. And I'm going to show you a study a little bit later in this first segment about K2 and spice, synthetic cannabinoids, or synthetic marijuana, that shows the reasons why people use these synthetic drugs. You'll find it very interesting, especially from the perspective of either being an employer or working with employers. But let's start with synthetic cannabinoids, or fake pot, fake marijuana. Often called spice or K2, those are product names, but they have become sort of synonymous with synthetic cannabinoids. So somebody might say spice, and because they're there are no regulations, of course, to determine how, this particular synthetic drug is made up. One manufacturer, if you will, versus another could be marketing it as Spice or K2 or Genie or any of the other names, and it could be completely different. But think of it as sort of an herbal replacement, okay? It looks like marijuana, as you can see off to the side there. Some type of plant substance has been sprinkled with this chemical that, when used, mimics the effects of marijuana. It looks organic, right? But it's not. It's actually made in a laboratory or at somebody's kitchen table or on a big table in an industrial park. It's, the places that have been rated are everything from A to Z, where these drugs get made. And they go by lots and lots of different names. But and again, because there's no regulation, there's no way to tell what you're getting. It's used in much the same way as real marijuana. People smoke it, people can snort it, etc. But it's not marijuana and it's not organic, okay? It's a chemical compound. Now, if we just agree to use the word spice, and we're referring to synthetic cannabinoids, it's probably here to stay because the money that's involved in this is unbelievable. The DEA estimates that there are at least 1,000 synthetic drug makers in the U.S., generating a market of over $120 billion. Well, they're part of the annual market of $120 billion for recreational drugs. It's often marketed as an incense, and it generates billions of dollars a year just in that particular area. There's actually a trade association, legitimate trade association, the North American Herbal Incense Trade Association, representing hundreds of manufacturers and wholesalers, retailers of incense products, some of whom are illicit incense manufacturers, okay? It's really a huge, huge market, and here's a little bit of a glimpse into why people would do this, okay? So if you bought a kilo of the raw material, you're going to spend somewhere between $1,500 and $2,500. A metric ton of the plant material that you're going to use with it, another $1,500. You add the packaging, you divide your end product into 3 to 5 gram packages, so a package with anywhere from 3 to 5 grams in it, and you sell a typical package for $30. Basically, according to the DEA, a $5,000 investment will result in about a $250,000 return when you sell it on the street at the retail level. So you can see why people are doing it. I mean, and the reason why it's going to be really, really hard to extract this out of our society, because the buy-in is so low and the potential return on your investment is incredibly high. And there are some reasons why people use that. I'm getting to that, and I'll come to that in a minute. The DEA has really done a lot on this topic. You can go to the DEA website and you can find a lot of material, a lot of sort of demand reduction educational material as well. I highly recommend just visiting the DEA website, among others. But the point here on this slide that I want to really emphasize is the fact that if you're drug testing for marijuana, which hopefully every employer is doing, it would be silly in today's day and age not to drug test for marijuana, even with the legal marijuana laws. And we could spend an hour talking just about that. In fact, I've done a marijuana webinar with AWSI in the past. But if you're testing for real marijuana and you think that you're going to be able to detect fake marijuana or these synthetic cannabinoids, you're wrong. It requires a different drug test altogether. You cannot detect synthetic cannabinoids with your, sort of SAMHSA 5-panel drug test or your 9 or 10 or 11 panel drug test. You have to test for the synthetic cannabinoids. It's not the normal test that you do, okay? As you might expect, and the legalized marijuana movement is well-funded and extremely well-organized throughout the country. And the real marijuana proponents are angered. I mean, there's actually been documentation of this. They're angered that people are sort of lumping fake marijuana in with legal or real marijuana because they want to legalize marijuana, right? But they're getting lumped in with all the negative publicity of synthetic marijuana. But it's called synthetic cannabinoids for a reason. The effects, the high that people are looking for, mimics the high of real marijuana. It's synthetic, but it acts like real marijuana on the user with some extraordinarily dangerous additional side effects. Okay, the synthetic pot that people use could be literally hundreds of times more potent than the THC that's found in typical marijuana, real marijuana today. The high may be about the same, somewhere up to about 30 minutes, but the effects can be similar, and that's of course what the user is looking for, but they can be much different. And in the workplace, you know, you would be sort of seeing a manifestation of the same types of outward behavior that real marijuana would cause on a person, and some additional ones. So it's not unusual for a user of synthetic cannabinoids, K2 spice, etc., to suffer from paranoia, to have hallucinations, tremor, seizures, rapid heartbeat, other cardiac problems, kidney damage. I mean, we don't even really know the long-term effects of using these synthetic drugs, and it could result in mental illness. I don't necessarily recommend you do this, but if you really wanted to, you know, really research this thing, and sometimes, you know, I regret that I have to research these things so much, but if you go onto YouTube and you type in K2 spice or effects of K2, you'll find videos of people who have actually video recorded friends and others who are, quote unquote, having a bad trip from using K2 and spice. And it's really sad. It's very, very sad stuff. Don't recommend it, but if you're interested, it's there. As I said, the DEA has done a lot on this. This was a report from 2013. I'm going to read it to you. It was from a Huffington Post article, but it's an interview, part of an interview. I just took snippets here from a special agent from the Denver division of the DEA, Barbara Roche. This is what she said. There can be a euphoria. There's a mental addiction, wanting that next high. There's vomiting, nausea, accelerated heart rate, blood pressure can shoot up, kidney damage. There's some very disturbing and more aggressive type reactions than we're seeing. Violence, almost like a freezing of the body that becomes statue-like, and everything shuts down. So it's everything. It's physical and it's psychological. That's pretty scary. Now, these are some extreme symptoms or side effects of using K2 and spice. You may observe some of these types of behavior in the workplace with somebody using K2 and spice. One of the ways that we've sort of measured, or we were measuring over the course of time, the levels of K2 and spice use was through calls to the U.S. poison control centers that are located all around the country. Those calls sort of peaked back in mid-2011. There was a pretty big decline or significant decline in 2013 and 2014 in terms of calls coming into the poison control centers. We're not really sure why that is. If you ask various experts, if you read some of the research on it, it may be because of heightened media exposure, the word of mouth, you know, getting around among young people in particular, that the effects of these drugs, well, mimicking marijuana can be much more dangerous than marijuana. But unfortunately, even with all that going on and the fact that the calls into the poison control centers have been reduced over the last couple of years, we're still seeing fairly high rates of the use of synthetic cannabinoids among young people. I just took this slide right off of a study called the Monitoring the Future survey from 2012. The Monitoring the Future survey has been coming out for many, many years. And so if you go back 10 years, 15 years, or maybe even 5 years ago, you're not going to find any information about the levels of teens using synthetic cannabinoids because it really wasn't an issue until about 4 or 5 years ago. Now, of course, this is something that the Monitoring the Future survey tracks very carefully. I'm not going to take the time to read all of this to you. That the section there in green is very interesting, but let me come down to these statistics. So how many teens are using synthetic marijuana? In 2012, 11% of American high school seniors used synthetic marijuana in the past year, and there were 11,406 emergency room visits in 2010 that were associated with synthetic marijuana. 75% were among adolescents and young adults between 12 and 29, and 77.5% involved males. So three-quarters, a little over three-quarters, of individuals who are using synthetic marijuana are men. They're males. It's tragic enough that 22.5% are females, but this tends to be a drug that is commonly used by males. And, of course, that 11% is pretty alarming. Now, again, we're not going to go take a lot of time on this slide, but I wanted you to have this information just so you could see the dropping off of the numbers of calls coming into the poison control centers. 2011 reached a high of nearly 7,000. Then it went down, dropped dramatically in 2013, and then it shot up another 1,000 in 2014. You can see the month-by-month number of calls coming into centers around the country. I just thought you'd find this interesting for later when you're looking at this data. Now, one of the questions that I get a lot of, I receive often through state-drug-testing-laws.com is, which states have banned or passed laws prohibiting the sale, the manufacture, or the use of synthetic cannabinoids? And the answer is all of them. The federal government's done that as well, and I've got a little slide coming up on that also. But all 50 states have banned synthetic cannabinoids in one way or another. You can find information about that using the link at the bottom of the slide there. It's the National Conference of State Legislature. That's a great website for finding this kind of information. And I'm not going to read this next slide. It's very dense, but I just want you to know there are two approaches to addressing this from a legal standpoint in terms of state laws. There's individual bans, which are bans on individual chemical compounds that are used to make synthetic cannabinoids and the bath salts or synthetic cathinones. And so you see in the middle of that first paragraph, JWH-018. That's a chemical compound that creates a version of spice. And HU-210 is another chemical compound. So some states have passed laws banning those particular chemical compounds. That's one way to do it. However, as we saw at the end of that video that we watched, the makers, the manufacturers are always sort of staying one step ahead of the law by altering the chemical compound or the chemical makeup of their particular brand of spice or K2 in the case of synthetic marijuana. So some states have started passing general bans, and this is sort of banning or prohibiting synthetic drugs overall. And you see that in states like New Jersey, for example, where they just sort of said, hey, listen, we can't keep up with the makers of these drugs. They're constantly changing the chemical compounds. Let's just ban, synthetic cannabinoids in general. And so you see a little bit of that, and that is perhaps a more effective way. There are some limitations to it. You wouldn't think so being a general ban, but there are some complications with that. But in the individual ban approach, there's just no way to keep up with all the constant changing of the chemical compounds. Now, the federal government in 2012 enacted the Synthetic Drug Abuse Prevention Act, which bans 31 different designer drugs. At the time, there were 20 synthetic marijuana chemicals that were reclassified as Schedule I drugs. So that was taking these chemical compounds, like I told you, the GWH-010 chemical compound, and putting it in there. So what they tried to do, putting it into Schedule I, is they tried to pick, at the time anyways, in 2012, the most commonly abused chemical compounds, the most commonly abused versions of spice, if you will. But the makers, again, are well ahead of the federal ban on this. And so one of the questions I get asked, let me clarify this. One of the questions I get asked is, why do we have state laws when the federal government has already banned synthetic cannabinoids? And if the federal government has banned synthetic cannabinoids, then this general ban over here in New Jersey, for example, must go beyond the federal law. And so the response to all of that is you have to approach it from both angles. You have to have the federal ban on these particular chemical compounds and some other drugs like synthetic cathinones, which are the bath salts. But you also need the state laws. and these general state laws in particular, the general banning approach, because in each state, the manufacturers take different routes to try to get their product to market. And so we've learned from many, many years of having an active ongoing drug war in the United States that criminal penalties are not really a deterrent for the guy who's looking at investing $5,000 and getting a $250,000 return on his investment. But in the federal law, there were criminal penalties built into it that are punishable by up to 20 years in prison. Now, I haven't heard of many people, to be honest, I haven't heard of anybody who's actually been convicted of any of these crimes. I'm sure it's happened, but the criminal penalties have not actually proven to be a big deterrent. Now, this is the information I promised you earlier. This is the reason why people use the drugs. And so there's a lot of information here. It'll be easier for you to look at it when you've got the slides and you're going through it later. Let me just point out, though, that this was a survey, if you will, of patients, and they were all adults, in a Midwestern substance abuse disorder regional treatment program. So, I'm not saying exactly where it took place, but somewhere in the Midwest. And the individuals were asked why they were using synthetic cannabinoids. They were all synthetic cannabinoid users. The number one reason, 91% said curiosity. 89% said it was to feel good or to get high. A substantial number reported that they used synthetic cannabinoids to relax or relieve tension, but 71% said they were getting high on synthetic cannabinoids because it reduced the fear or the concern of testing positive in a workplace drug test, or maybe in a treatment drug test. In other words, they saw using synthetic fake pot as a way of getting around somebody's drug testing program. And there have been other studies, and I cite one of them there. You can go to the Caesar Facts, Volume 22, Issue 27, that I put there in that last bullet. If you want to go back and you want to look at other studies that have come to the same conclusion, that one of the primary reasons why many people use synthetic cannabinoids is to bypass a drug test for real marijuana. 71% is a very high number. I've been dealing with statistics and percentages all my career for the last 25 plus years. That's a big number. That's a big number when you're talking about a motivation to use synthetic cannabinoids. And you've got the chart off to the right, a little hard to see, but there's the source at the bottom there if you want to look at it. Now and I told you there have been other reports on rates of positive drug tests, related to synthetic cannabinoids. So this was 2010, so this goes back a few years, but it found that 30 to 35% of court-ordered juvenile probation departments were seeing positives for synthetic cannabinoids. 30 to 35%. The Georgia drug court system sent 1,000 samples in for analysis and had a 15% positive rate. And a survey of the National Laboratory Certification Program found that 6 labs, just the 6 that provided data, had positive rates for synthetic cannabinoids ranging from 2% all the way up to 50%, with an average of just over 20%. So if you know the old adage, right, from Field of Dreams, if you build it, they will come. If you test for synthetic cannabinoids, you're going to get positive. Now, there'll be a period of time in which your positives are high, but over the course of time, as your employees and others, whatever your type of drug testing program is, once they learn that you test for synthetic cannabinoids, for K2 and spice, the deterrent impact will kick in. Now, you do have people who are hardcore users who are really stuck, and they're not going to be deterred by a drug test, and there are lots and lots of examples of this. I highly recommend, if you're interested in more information, that you go to the spiceaddictionsupport.org website. Here you will find many, many different stories, real-world stories from people who have become addicted to K2 and spice. This is just one. I'm going to read this quote here at the bottom, but some of these are really heartbreaking. And there's lots of other good deterrent educational information at spiceaddictionsupport.org, so I recommend it. This individual wrote, I was on it for about a year and had to go to the hospital twice for kidney and gallbladder-related problems. I was too ashamed to say how I became sick. Now, 2 years later, I'm using again because I'm fooling myself into thinking the highs help my depression. God help me. So, and there are lots and lots of these. I mean, there are tons of them. So the problem is real. It has a direct impact on the workplace because people are using synthetic cannabinoids to avoid testing positive in a drug test, and yet the effects of synthetic marijuana on the outward behavior or performance of an employee are very similar to the effects that real marijuana have on your employees, as well as some very dangerous additional effects and symptoms that are, probably perhaps happening after an individual is no longer able to hold down a job. But leading up to that more tragic level of abuse, these are individuals who are using this drug, 71% admitted it, using these drugs, these synthetic cannabinoids, to avoid testing positive in your workplace drug testing program. The levels are high and the risks are significant. Now, we're going to switch gears. And also, if you have any questions as we go through the presentation, just jot them in the Q&A function or section of your screen there. If we don't get to your question during today's live presentation, we'll make every attempt to follow up and send out responses and answers to the questions that you submit. I'm not a scientist, so I can't really get into I could find out information for you on the more technical scientific part of these issues, but it's not something that I typically have information right at the top of my head. Let's switch gears now and talk about bath salts. When we use the term bath salts, we're not really sort of talking about real bath salts or the bath salts that you might put in your bath, right? This is a synthetic cathinone. Kind of like K2 and Spice in terms of the trend. There are these designer stimulants, if you will, bath salts being one of them, that are, again, produced in clandestine labs. They're sold online. They might be sold at a smoke shop, a gas station, a head shop, etc. They're promoted as bath salts, as that second bullet says. They may be, listed as research chemicals or even plant food. That's really where it all started, was, looking at these were actually used as part of plant food. But the labeling is somewhat misleading. It's intended to circumvent, if you will, the regulations that prohibit the manufacture and sale of these illicit bath salts, okay? And you see the ingredients there in that third bullet there, methadone, methylone, MDPV, and there are others. Additional forms of designer stimulants can be sold as legal MDMA or sold and veiled as other types of products that contain MDMA, okay? And this is what it looks like. It looks like this and looks like other things. There's lots of street names for it or brand names that are being promoted, sort of in the marketplace out there on the street. According to the American Association of Poison Control Centers, okay, this is the same group that I quoted a little bit earlier. I'm going to skip down a little bit. Referring to the bath salts, these are powerful illegal drugs that have been tested, that have not been tested for safety, and users don't really know exactly what chemicals they're putting into their body. The side effects can be permanent or can cause permanent problems. So how are bath salts used? Well, people don't put it in the water and then, lay in the water and, soak up the bath salts. They snort it, or in some cases they inject it into their body. We use the term bath salts, but again, it's something very much different, and we don't really know what the long-term effects of using quote-unquote bath salts, just like we don't know with synthetic cannabinoids. We don't really know what the long-term effects are of using these drugs, okay? We're fairly certain that they can have very negative effects on the cardiovascular system of the body. But the users they're looking for, those three bullets there, effects sought by the users, feelings of physical and mental well-being, exhilaration, euphoria, increased alertness, energy, and motor activity, and postponement of hunger and fatigue. But the Poison Control Centers and the National Drug Intelligence Agency have all issued alerts noting that the numbers of emergency room visits related to these drugs was increasing for a period of time. And I think I might have a slide coming up on that trend as well. The effects, however, are very similar to K2 and Spice. Paranoia, extreme anxiety, delusions, combativeness, suicidal thoughts, and we saw that with K2 and Spice also, chest pains, and what is sometimes called the Superman effect, which is this excited delirium, sort of going beyond just sort of the normal outward manifestation of being happy or excited or feeling in particularly strong or powerful. Now, and by that I'm not trying to describe PCP, two different substances altogether. Now, if you look at the source at the bottom, this is still available online. I'm pretty sure I checked this one just recently. This was from 2011. These types of things never change. So the effects of bath salts are not going to somehow become less dangerous in 2015 versus 2011. So this kind of information is timeless. The chemical substance of these drugs is just as dangerous today as it was in 2011 and 2012, et cetera. And you're still finding headlines all across the country of individuals who have suffered death, they've committed heinous crimes, and other extremely grotesque crimes that they've committed while under the influence of bath salts. And I put a few of them here. I put some sources down there at the bottom. But people under the influence of bath salts can be very dangerous, and you've heard about some that have gained national attention on the news. The number of calls into the poison control centers has dropped again significantly since 2011 when it reached its height through 2014. I did put some sources at the bottom for you. If you want to find a really good fact sheet on bath salts, I recommend this this bottom source down here. This is from the Poison Control Center, so it's the American Association of Poison Control Centers. And you'll find not only some good statistics, but you'll find some fact sheet information there that is very, very helpful. Again, when we talk about laws, all 50 states and the territory of Puerto Rico have banned substituted cathinones. Okay? And again, you can find information at the National Conference of State Legislature website. Bath salts are illegal. The drug that we're talking about is illegal, and it's been banned in all 50 states. Again, however, it is in part a matter of trying to keep up with the manufacturers who are constantly changing the chemical compounds. So if you're in a state that has taken a more sort of myopic approach to this, and they've banned certain chemical compounds, it's possible and very likely that the bath salts that are being sold in your state are made up of chemical compounds different than those compounds that have been banned by your state. However, if you're in a state with a general banning law, like New Jersey, and I keep using that as an example, then all these types of drugs are just sort of lumped in together. And so, same thing we said about K2 and spice applies here as well to bath salts. If you ban the chemical compounds, then there are probably people out there who are creating what is essentially a legal version of these bath salts, unless they're using certain chemicals or product that in and of itself has been banned, and that's possible. So the bottom line here is check your state law to know what you're dealing with. The federal government, at the same time in 2012 that they banned K2 and spice and those various chemical compounds of K2 and spice, also included in the Synthetic Drug Abuse Prevention Act the banning of certain chemicals or products that are used to create bath salts, the MDPV and the methadone. These are common ingredients that are used with bath salts, and they're now banned. It says by the DEA. That is technically true, but it was banned by the federal government, and the same types of criminal penalties apply here as well. If you got a little extra time and you really want to delve into this, I didn't have time to sort of create a snippet of this report. This is a Chris Hansen Dateline story, and Chris Hansen, of course, very famous for his predator reports on capturing predators live in the act. But he did a report on synthetic drugs like bath salts in particular. You can find it by using that URL. Just cut and paste it when you get the slide deck. And And if you want to watch that show, it was a Dateline presentation. It wasn't from that long ago, just I think a few weeks ago. But a very good report also. Again, I didn't have time to sort of cut and paste a snippet of it for you today, but I highly recommend it. You'll find a lot of good information there. Now, we've talked about synthetic cathinones, the bath salts. We've talked about synthetic cannabinoids, the K2, the Spice, Genie, all the different names that are used for synthetic marijuana. There are other drugs, though. It's not just those two categories of drugs that you have to be concerned about. And this is something that a company like AWSI can help you with. They can help you understand what these other drugs are and what possible threat they may have to you. If you're a parent on today's call, then you're going to have an additional level of interest in some of these emerging drug trends, because these are things that our young people are exposed to, whether they're in high school or maybe as young adults, and they're exposed to these drugs while they're at college or while they're working away from home in another city. So it's important to know about these drugs no matter what. If you're interested as an employer, you're interested as a parent. During the video that we watched, there was reference to Molly. So Molly is typically sort of marketed or talked about as a pure form of MDMA. It can have lots and lots of different chemicals and drugs built into it. It's just a term that is used, Molly, and it has, as you see there, it sort of flooded the market according to the DEA. Between 2009 and 2012, Molly increased 100-fold in some states, and emergency room visits involving MDMA and this sort of pure form of MDMA, often called Molly, jumped 123% between 2004 and I think it was 2011 or 12 when that, or 2011 when that study came out. 22,498 emergency room visits in 2011. This is a drug that's often used by young people as, well, got a slide coming up on it, young people who are maybe in the party scene or the rave scene or the dance scene. $15 to $50 for a single dose, as much as $100 for a gram. Often ingested orally, but it can be inhaled or injected. And the high begins within an hour, maybe within even 10 or about 20 minutes. It starts to plateau. It levels off and starts to plateau, but it can last for about 2 to 3 hours. So the individual who's high on this pure MDMA, this Molly, can be under the influence of that drug for up to 3 hours, maybe a little bit longer. Okay, and there's a coming down sort of phase that the user goes through that if we're talking about somebody who's used the drug to try to really sort of stay on alert at work, they're going to have some symptoms involved in the 2 to 3 hour high period, and then they're going to have some additional feelings of fatigue that are going to happen during the coming down period of time. So on the front end and on the back end, this is a drug that you would not want individuals to be using well on your payroll, well at work. And you can find a lot of information about Molly right now on the internet because it's still a drug that's in the news. Now, another drug that's in the news a lot is called Crocodile. I have purposely avoided putting any pictures of Crocodile on today's webinar, mostly because I personally cannot stand to look at them. I'm just going to read that first part as a lead into what I'm about to tell you. Crocodile is a toxic homemade opioid that has been used as a cheap heroin substitute in poor rural areas of Russia, has recently featured in news reports alleging its appearance in parts of the United States. It is in the United States. It's a synthetic form of heroin, and it actually has, well, if you go down to that second to last sentence, Crocodile gets its name from the scaly, gray-green dead skin that forms at the site of the injection. The flesh destroyed by Crocodile becomes gangrenous, and in some cases, limb amputation is necessary in order to save somebody's life. So part of the reason why I didn't put the pictures up today, and there are some very graphic pictures out there, is because somebody who uses this drug is almost entirely likely to experience this sort of flesh-eating look on their body. And I've seen the pictures. I mean, it is an extremely destructive drug to use. You know, if you could get this information into the minds of people that this is a toxic chemical, it may mimic heroin, but it is much more dangerous and much more destructive, then maybe some people might just sort of have the strength to avoid using it to resist the temptation. But once they use it, the likelihood of experiencing this flesh-eating symptom is fairly high. And there's no real way back once that flesh-eating process has started. As employers, you're probably not going to see this in your workplace. I mean, it depends on, you know, the nature of your workplace, I guess. But it's something to be aware of because it's a trend out there, and it's a more sort of progressive stage of drug abuse. A lot of information here. I'm not going to read all this to you, a lot of dense copy, but I did put the source at the bottom if you'd like to look at this later. But these are a couple of different categories of drug abuse. The first one, if you hear something called Cloud9, Relax, or Crown, this is a liquid product. It is sold in eye drop bottles, and it's often used with a vaporizing device of some sort, e-cigarettes maybe, or hookah pens, if you're familiar with those. There have been numerous hospitalizations of individuals using these drugs in Macomb County in Michigan. And so the Department of Health in Michigan put out an emergency warning and a ban on the sale of these drugs. That's not necessarily going to deter somebody from doing that, but that's a very dangerous synthetic drug right there. This next category, Mojo, Spice K2, Scooby Snacks, excuse me. Forgot my Scooby-Doo days there. This is sort of the new age of synthetic marijuana here, but a more sort of new level of dangerousness in terms of the type of synthetic cannabinoids. As you see there, the use of this particular strain of or strand of synthetic cannabinoids resulted in over 150 hospital visits just in Baton Rouge and Lafayette in October last year. And so that prompted government action to ban the drug in that state. The symptoms very similar to what we talked about earlier. But as the makers of these drugs are trying to stay one step ahead of the law by making different chemical compounds, and again, with absolutely no regulation, right? So you don't really know what you're getting from one maker to the next, and there are no rules governing this. So, you know, the drug is becoming, in some cases, more and more dangerous to the user. And just like we used to say with, you know, the prize in a Cracker Jack box, you never know what you're going to get. You never know, literally, what's going to happen to you when you put these drugs into your system. Now, there is a drug over in Europe called Superman. This was just reported last month, Superman pills. An alert was issued in the Netherlands warning about these pills that have the distinctive Superman logo on the packaging. They're sold as MDMA, okay, ecstasy or Molly, and they've had some very dangerous side effects with these drugs. Individuals have actually died. We've had deaths from Molly here in the United States as well, but from this new Superman version of Molly or ecstasy, they're concerned now, of course, that this new strand of the drug is making its way across the ocean here into the United States. There's a word right there in the fourth line down in parentheses that I don't know how to pronounce. I could probably sound it out, methamphetamine, something like that. Give me points for trying. But the bottom line is what people are calling it. So these are called Superman pills. If you hear something like that, you see something like that on the news, that's essentially what we're talking about. So let me sort of wrap this up with a conclusion. I do a lot of webinars every year, all on drug topics, substance abuse prevention, drug testing, etc. The one that tends to draw not the biggest crowd maybe because that's still legalized marijuana, medical marijuana, which AWSI did recently, and I'm sure if you'd like to see the recording of that, they could make that available to you. But one of the topics that was really hot 2 years ago sort of leveled off last year. I think we're going to see it as a hot topic again this year, is synthetic cannabinoids and bath salts. But I'm going to say synthetic cannabinoids in particular. We do a survey of the drug testing industry every year through my company, the Current Consulting Group. And there was very sort of a leveling off of concern or interest about synthetic cannabinoids last year, reflected in the U.S. survey. However, we also have been doing for the last 2 years, we'll do it again this year, we do an international survey of drug testing trends. And the use of these synthetic drugs with the companies that we interviewed for our survey in Europe, it is a big concern among those companies. And it's something that, as it sort of spreads from one continent to the next, can have some devastating effects. And I'm not just talking about the very tragic effects that it can have on the individual, which are devastating to them, to their families, etc. But it has an effect on society. It has an effect on the workplace. And as we talked about earlier, if you're testing for marijuana, for cocaine, opiates, amphetamines, and PCP, which is that traditional 5-panel drug test that the federal government requires as part of the DOT regulations, then you're only going to catch people or deter people from using those drugs. We looked, from the survey that we looked at earlier at the beginning of today's presentation, we saw, of course, that the abuse of psychotherapeutic substances like the hydrocodones and the oxycodones of the world is the #2 category of drug abuse in the United States. Among young people, just from the data from that same study, it would appear that the abuse of psychotherapeutics is #2 to marijuana. But in reality, if we look at the survey called Monitoring the Future, we find that the levels of abuse of K2 and spice, synthetic cannabinoids in particular, is really the #2 drug of abuse. And we also know that nearly 3/4 of adults who were in a treatment program in the Midwest said that the reason that they used synthetic cannabinoids was to bypass getting caught in a drug test for real marijuana. Now, that could have been a drug test in their treatment program or a drug test at work. It doesn't matter. The fact is, people are using synthetic marijuana, K2 and spice, as a way to try to get around testing positive. Call it a form of drug test cheating, except they're not giving up the drugs. You know, they're not having to sneak fake urine into the bathroom stall. They're just switching to a different form of marijuana. It's not real marijuana, it's synthetic, but it's giving them the same high that they're looking for, and it has the same effect on their behavior and their performance in the workplace as does real marijuana when your employees use real pot. So all I'm saying is, if you're not testing for the drugs that people are using, then you really don't know for sure that you have a drug-free workplace. And your policy has to reflect these drugs that you test for. Your drug testing policy is critical to the success of your program and to achieving your drug testing objectives. And if one of the objectives of your drug testing program is to have a drug-free workplace so that you can reduce accidents, reduce the number of workers' comp claims, increase the health of your bottom line, et cetera, whatever it may be, you've got to be testing for the drugs that people are using. And in some parts of the country and in some types of occupations and industries, the use of synthetic drugs is a big problem. And so you need to get with your provider, company like AWSI, for example, and just find out what would it take to add K2 and spice to my panel if I wanted to test for synthetic cannabinoids, so that you can address this issue, create that deterrent among your workers, and the problem starts to reduce itself. Anyways, that's all. I'm going to conclude right now by just saying thanks again to AWSI for sponsoring today's webinar and for all the webinars that they've been doing to provide this kind of information to employers and to drug testing providers. And with that, I'm going to turn the microphone back over to, I think, to Jessica or to Sammy.
Thank you very much, Bill, and thank you, of course, to AWSI, Advanced Workplace Strategies. would like to thank those of you who are on the call today, and we hope that you have found today's presentation informative and helpful. This presentation was recorded, and you will receive instructions informing you how to access the recording and the slides. Thank you for your attendance today. This concludes today's webinar.